She had carried that loaf across town in both arms like it was something precious, because to her, it was. And the moment she set it on the judging table, the woman standing closest to her leaned over to her friend, didn't even bother to lower her voice, and said, "Lord, who let the scarecrow in?" Laughter. Quiet at first, then not quiet at all. Elena Ashcroft stood at that table while every woman in that hall looked at her bread the way people look at something they've already decided to throw away. Not one of them reached for it. Not one of them even bent down to smell it. They just stepped around it like it wasn't worth the trouble of an insult. Except it was, because the insults kept coming anyway. She was 27 years old, and she had baked that bread from a starter her mother had kept alive for 30 years. 30 years. And not a single person in that room cared. But then a stranger walked in from the back of the hall, and everything changed. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel is where stories like Elena's get told, real, raw, and the kind that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss one, because we post every single week and you do not want to fall behind. While you're at it, tap the like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to Iron Hollow, because this one is just getting started. The autumn that year came in mean. It didn't drift in soft the way people remember autumn when they're being sentimental about it. It came in with wind that had teeth, stripping leaves off the cottonwoods before they'd even had a chance to turn gold, pushing cold air down from the mountains like it had somewhere better to be. The kind of autumn that reminds you winter isn't interested in whether you're ready or not. Elena had been up since 4 in the morning. She hadn't slept well. She almost never did anymore. But 4 in the morning was earlier than usual, even for her. She'd lain in bed for a while, listening to the wind press against the walls of the house, that low, continuous moan that got into your head and made it hard to think about anything pleasant. Then she'd given up pretending, pulled on her work clothes in the dark, and gone downstairs. The kitchen was cold enough that her breath showed when she opened the door to the back room where she kept her starter. She'd been nursing it through this temperature drop all week, moving it closer to the stove at night, checking on it the way you'd check on something living, which it was. The starter had a smell that most people couldn't describe without wrinkling their nose, but Elena had grown up with that smell. It was the smell of her mother's kitchen, of mornings before her father got sick, of something older than either of them that had been passed down through hands she would never hold again. She fed it, watched it, waited. By 5:30, she had her dough mixed. She didn't measure the way the recipe books told you to. She measured by feel, by memory, by the weight of the dough against her palms. Her mother had taught her that. Recipes are for people who don't trust themselves yet, she used to say. Elena hadn't always understood that. She understood it now. The rye flour was dark and dense, and it smelled like earth after rain. She mixed in the caraway seeds, not too many, just enough to give it something to say, and she worked the dough with the heels of her hands until it came together the way she wanted it to, smooth on the outside, but still with some resistance in the middle. She shaped it into a round, scored the top with 3 cuts the way she always did, and set it to proof near the stove. Then she went outside and fed the animals. Because there were chores to do whether it was Harvest Fair Day or any other day, and the chickens didn't care about either. Boy, she had been living alone on the homestead for going on 3 years now. Her father had passed first, 2 winters back, and her mother had followed him 7 months later with the kind of quiet surrender that happens when someone decides the person they've been waiting for their whole life is finally in a place they can get to. Elena had held her mother's hand when she went. She hadn't cried right away. She'd gone out to the barn and stood in the dark for a long time, not doing anything in particular, just standing there until the feeling inside her chest settled down enough that she could breathe without it hurting quite so much. After that, she'd run the farm herself. She wasn't good at asking for help. That was something the women in town said about her, sometimes as a criticism and sometimes as something closer to bafflement, as if self-sufficiency in a woman was a problem to be solved rather than a trait to be respected. She knew they talked. She wasn't naive about that. Iron Hollow was the kind of town where talk was cheap and privacy was a thing you had to fight for, and Elena had spent 3 years mostly losing that fight. The homestead was a 1.5 miles outside of town, which helped. Distance was its own kind of buffer, but she couldn't stay out there forever. She needed things from the general store. She needed the feed merchant. She needed, occasionally, to stand among other human beings and be reminded that she was still part of a world that included them. And she had this bread. The harvest fair was the one event she let herself look forward to. Not because she expected to win anything. She'd entered twice before, and placed second once, third once, without anyone making much of it either way. But the baking contest was the one place where she felt like what she made actually mattered. Like the work she put into that starter, into every loaf she'd pulled from that oven, added up to something that could be seen and recognized by someone other than herself. She should have known better by now. She told herself that later, lying awake in the dark the night after the fair. She should have known better, but she hadn't, and that was the part that made the whole thing worse. The town hall filled up fast that afternoon. Elena arrived 20 minutes before the contest started, which she thought was enough time. She was wrong. The tables inside were already crowded with entries, pale, golden-crusted loaves that caught the light and smelled like butter and sweetness and everything the crowd responded to. Mrs. Hargrove had brought her white honey bread again, the one she'd won with 3 years running, and it sat at the center of the table like it had reserved that spot in advance. Which, honestly, it probably had. Elena set her loaf at the end of the table. It looked exactly like what it was. Dark, compact, with a tight crumb and a thick crust that hadn't gone for beauty, because beauty wasn't the point. It looked like bread that meant something, bread that had a reason behind it. But she could see in the 2 seconds she allowed herself to look at it next to everything else on that table, that it also looked like something that didn't belong there. She stepped back and found a place to stand near the wall. She watched the room fill. She watched women arrive in good dresses with their hair pinned up and their husbands trailing behind them with the look of men who had long since stopped asking what they were doing at these things and had simply accepted that this was how Saturdays in October went. Children ran between the tables until someone's mother hissed at them to stop. The smell of cider and pine resin and too many people in a closed space mixed together into something that was almost pleasant if you were in the right mood for it. Elena was trying to be in the right mood for it. She watched the judges take their positions. 3 women from town, 2 of them married to men who owned most of the land around Iron Hollow, and a third who was the wife of the county treasurer. They wore their authority the way certain women wore good jewelry, lightly enough that you might mistake it for something they hadn't thought about, when in fact they'd thought about nothing else. The judging began at the far end of the table and moved down. Elena watched each loaf get considered. Each one received a comment, sometimes a nod, sometimes an actual spoken observation that carried across the room. Beautiful color on this one, lovely texture. The woman beside her, whose name Elena couldn't remember, leaned over to murmur something approving each time the judges moved to the next entry. Then they reached Elena's bread. The 3 women stopped in front of it. There was a pause. Not the kind of pause that happens when someone is taking something in. The kind of pause that happens when people who have already made up their minds are simply going through the motions of pretending to consider. One of them leaned down slightly, as if she was going to smell it. Then she straightened up without doing so. She looked at the woman beside her. Something passed between them that had no words and didn't need any. They moved on. That was it. They just moved on. Elena kept her face still. She was good at that. 3 years of living alone had taught her that certain feelings were best kept entirely behind your eyes, where nobody could get to them. But her hands, down at her sides, were pressing into fists. She hadn't even realized it until the woman standing beside her said, quietly, and with what might have been genuine sympathy or might have been something else entirely, "It's a very hearty-looking bread, dear." The winners were announced 20 minutes later. Mrs. Hargrove won first place. Again. Elena clapped with everyone else and meant none of it, which made her feel small, but there it was. The second and third place went to 2 loaves she'd barely noticed when she came in, both of them pale and fine-crumbed and exactly what the room had been expecting. Her loaf sat at the end of the table. Nobody touched it. Nobody tasted it. A few people walked past it on their way to the cider table and glanced at it. The way you glance at something that raises a question you don't care enough to ask. A couple of children ran their fingers along the edge of the table near it, and one of their mothers pulled them back with a quick, pointed look in Elena's general direction that said everything about what she thought of that particular loaf's fitness for consumption. Elena heard, from somewhere to her left, the voice she would later be unable to stop hearing in the dark. Someone should tell her that bread is supposed to look like something you'd want to eat. She couldn't see who said it. She didn't turn around to look. She just stood there with her hands pressed flat against her skirt, and the noise of the hall washing over her, and the very clear, very physical sensation of being the most alone she had ever felt in a room full of people. She was going to go get her bread and leave. That was what she was going to do. Walk to the end of that table, pick it up without making eye contact with anyone, and walk out the door and go home, where the only audience she had was the chickens, who at least weren't judging her loaf by the color of its crust. She took one step toward the table, and that was when she heard the hall go quiet. Not gradually. All at once, the way sound disappears when something happens that nobody expected. He came in through the back door. She didn't notice him right away. She noticed the quiet first, then she turned to see what had caused it. He was tall, not dramatically so, but tall enough that he stood a head above most of the men in the room. He was wearing a coat that had seen considerable use and boots with the kind of dust on them that suggested he hadn't come from nearby. He had a hat in his hand and a look on his face that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't making any effort either. The face of a man who had learned a long time ago to take stock of a room before deciding what he thought of it. She later learned his name was Gideon Mercer. Cattle buyer. Known across 3 counties for being the kind of man who didn't tell you your stock was worth more than it was just to make you feel good about doing business with him. The kind of man people said was hard but fair, which in frontier terms was about the highest compliment available. At that moment, she didn't know any of that. She just watched him scan the room, stop at the table, and walk toward it. He looked at the bread entries the way he probably looked at cattle at auction. Not the way you look when you're performing interest, but the way you look when you're actually seeing something and making up your mind about it. He moved down the table slowly, stopped at the honey bread, studied it for a moment, moved on, stopped at the second place entry, considered it, moved on. Then he reached the end of the table. He stopped in front of her loaf. He stood there for a moment longer than he'd stood in front of anything else on that table. He bent down slightly, actually bent down the way the judge hadn't, and smelled it. His expression didn't change. He straightened up. Then he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small folding knife, and opened it. The woman standing nearest to him took a small step backward, which was actually funny if you thought about it, though nobody was laughing. He cut a piece off the end of Elena's loaf, put it in his mouth, chewed. The hall was so quiet that Elena could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Then Gideon Mercer turned around to face the room. Not any particular person in it, just the room in general, and said in a voice that was perfectly level and carried to every corner without him raising it at all, "This is the only loaf worth taking home." He reached into his chest pocket and set coins on the table beside the bread, full price. He picked up the loaf, tucked it under his arm, put his hat on, and walked out the back door. The hall stayed silent for about 4 full seconds after the door closed behind him. Then it erupted. Not in anger, in confusion. In that particular kind of social turbulence that happens when something has occurred that nobody has a ready script for. Elena heard snatches of conversation firing off in every direction. Who is that? Does anyone know him? Did he pay for that? Why would he? And underneath all of it, just below the surface, the sound of the certainties that had filled that room 10 minutes ago beginning to develop cracks. Elena stood exactly where she had been standing. She was trying to process what had just happened. Because the strangest part wasn't that he'd bought her bread. The strangest part was how he'd done it. Not as charity, not with any kind of look at me being generous energy, not even with a glance in her direction to acknowledge that she was the person who had baked it. He had simply evaluated it, decided it was worth what it was worth, paid for it, and left. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like the room full of people who had passed it over were the ones who had it wrong. And that was simply a fact that didn't require any further comment. She became aware that people were looking at her now, not with the sideways glances she'd been getting all afternoon, with actual direct attention, the kind that comes with recalibration. The woman who had called her bread hearty was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. 2 of the judges had turned from the winning table to look at the end where Elena had been standing, as if they were seeing that end of the table for the first time. Elena looked at the empty space where her loaf had been. She looked at the coins. She picked them up, put them in her pocket, and walked out. The cold air hit her the moment she stepped through the door, sharp and clean after the close warmth of the hall, and she stood on the step for a moment and let it clear her head. Her chest felt tight in a way that wasn't quite grief, and wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite anything she had a word for yet. She walked to where her horse was tied, untied him, and started home. She did not let herself cry until she was past the edge of town and there was nothing around her but open land and the sound of the wind in the grass. And she was not entirely sure, even then, whether she was crying because of the way those women had looked at her bread or because of the way one stranger hadn't. The homestead was dark when she got back. She hadn't left a lamp burning. She usually didn't because there'd been nobody to come home to for 3 years, so there was no point in lighting a lamp for yourself. She put the horse up, went inside, got the fire going, and sat at the kitchen table in the growing warmth for a long time without doing anything in particular. She fed the starter before she went to bed. She stood at the back room shelf with the lamp in one hand and looked at the old clay crock her mother had kept the starter in for 30 years. The one with the hairline crack along the base that she'd sealed with beeswax twice already, and would need to seal again before winter truly set in. The starter inside was active and healthy, bubbling softly the way it always did in the evening, and she pressed her palm against the outside of the crock and stood there for a moment feeling its faint warmth. She thought about the way that man had bent down to smell her bread. The way he'd said worth. Not good. Not interesting. Worth. She covered the crock, took her lamp, and went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time, and for once the wind against the walls didn't sound like something trying to get in. It sounded, for the first time in a while, like something that was simply passing through on its way somewhere else. She was asleep before she knew it, which was not nothing at all. The talk started before Elena even made it back to the homestead that night. She didn't know that, of course. She was already past the edge of town, already riding through the dark with her jaw set and her eyes dry by then, already thinking about the starter and the cracked crock and whether the beeswax seal would hold through January. She wasn't thinking about Gideon Mercer. She was trying not to. But back in the town hall, the talk was already spreading the way talk in Iron Hollow always spread, fast and with additions. By the time Mrs. Hargrove got home to her husband that evening, the story had already acquired details that hadn't been there when it happened. By Sunday morning, it had grown a second layer. By Monday, when Elena rode into town for feed and supplies and kept her eyes straight ahead the way she always did, she could feel it in the way people looked at her. That specific quality of attention that meant she had become, without asking for it, the subject of something. She bought her feed. She bought a tin of lard and a paper of salt and a new length of rope for the fence on the north side. She did not look at anyone directly, and nobody spoke to her directly, but she heard enough in the gaps between conversations to understand the broad shape of what was being said. The man's name was Gideon Mercer. He was a cattle buyer out of somewhere east. Nobody was quite sure exactly where. He was known, she gathered this from 2 separate fragments of conversation, neither of which was addressed to her, as someone whose opinion on quality was worth listening to. The kind of man whose word on a price could shift what an entire herd went for at market. She filed that away and didn't think about what to do with it. She went home and repaired the fence and didn't think about it some more. She was very good at not thinking about things. 3 weeks passed. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees and stayed there. Elena got the north pasture ready for winter, pulled the last of the root vegetables, put up the last of the preserves in the cellar. She baked twice a week the way she always did, partly because she needed bread, and partly because the baking itself was the 1 hour in the day when her mind went quiet in a way that sleep couldn't always manage. She had started selling a loaf here and there. Not at the fair. She was done with the fair, at least for this year. But through a small understanding she'd worked out with the woman who ran the boarding house at the edge of town, a practical woman named Ruth Daly, who didn't much care what her guests ate as long as they paid for it and didn't complain. Ruth had tried Elena's bread once, months ago, and had come back for it. She wasn't the type to comment on why she liked things. She just came back. That was recommendation enough. It wasn't much income. It helped. Elena was making a second delivery to Ruth's on a Thursday afternoon when she turned the corner past the feed merchant and nearly walked into Gideon Mercer. She stopped short. He stopped too, a step before the same collision, with the reflexes of someone who spent a lot of time on unpredictable ground. They looked at each other for a moment. He was wearing different clothes than at the fair, but the same coat, which had clearly been through enough seasons that it had earned a kind of permanent status. He had a piece of paper in one hand that looked like a list of some kind, and a general air of purpose, as though he'd been in the middle of getting somewhere. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. She didn't ask how he knew her name. In Iron Hollow, knowing names wasn't remarkable. It would have been more remarkable if he hadn't. "Mr. Mercer," she said. A pause. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but not comfortable either. The kind of pause where both people are doing a quick internal inventory of what's appropriate. "You're still in town," she said, which was not the most interesting thing she could have opened with, but was at least accurate. "Finishing up some business," he said. "Few more days." She nodded, shifted the bread under her arm. He looked at it. Not pointedly, just the way your eyes go to a thing when you recognize it, and then looked back at her. "You bake twice a week?" he asked. She blinked. "How did you know that?" He paused. Something that might have been the start of something else crossed his face, and then settled into neutral. "Ruth Daly mentioned it. I'm staying at the boarding house." She thought about that. Ruth hadn't mentioned him, but Ruth didn't mention most things. That was part of why Elena liked her. "Yes," Elena said, "Tuesdays and Thursdays." He nodded like that was useful information, which was an odd thing to nod at like it was useful information. "Well," she said, and meant it as a way of ending the conversation, which he seemed to understand because he stepped to the side to let her pass. She went and delivered the bread to Ruth and spent the walk home telling herself that the entire exchange had been entirely unremarkable. She saw him one more time before he left town. She was at the well behind the general store, drawing water, and he came around the corner of the building with the same ground-covering walk he seemed to have everywhere, the walk of someone who covered a lot of distance and had stopped being aware that they did it. He stopped when he saw her, looked at the well, looked at the bucket in her hand. "That handle giving you trouble?" he asked. She looked at the handle. She had been fighting it for the past 10 minutes. The wood had swollen with the damp, and the mechanism that was supposed to lock the winch in place kept slipping, so every time she got the bucket partway up, she had to start wrestling with it to keep it from dropping back down. Her forearm ached from it. "It's fine," she said, which was not true, and they both knew it wasn't true. He came over without being asked, not in a way that pushed her out of the spot, just positioned himself at the other side of the well with a look at the mechanism. He reached out and touched the handle where the wood had warped, pressed it in a specific direction she hadn't tried, and the lock caught with a solid clunk. "It's off-center," he said. "The pin catches if you press toward you first." She tried it. The bucket came up smoothly. "Thank you," she said. "Sure," he said. He didn't linger. He just went on wherever he'd been going, and she filled her bucket and went home. That was the last she saw of him for 6 weeks. Iron Hollow moved into its winter rhythms in the way small frontier towns did, slowly, with a certain collective resignation that was also a kind of relief. The harshness of winter simplified things. You stopped pretending you might do the bigger projects and accepted that for the next several months your job was to keep people and animals warm and fed, and everything else could wait for spring. Elena kept to herself more than usual. She had enough stores laid up and enough work to do on the homestead that she could go a week and a half without needing to come into town, and she took that option more often than not. The quiet suited her. It had always suited her. She just hadn't always admitted that it also, sometimes, became a different kind of thing after a while, a heavier kind of quiet, the kind that had weight to it. She kept baking. She kept sending loaves with Ruth's delivery boy when he came out on Thursdays, and Ruth kept sending back payment without comment. She had started a second starter, not to replace the first, but as a backup, kept in a separate vessel in a slightly different spot in the back room so that if something happened to one, she'd still have the other. She'd done it after a nightmare she hadn't been able to remember except for the feeling it had left behind, something about the starter going wrong and there being nothing left to save. She was in the back room tending the second starter on a Tuesday morning when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. She almost didn't go to the door. She didn't get visitors. The few times someone had come out to the homestead in the past 2 years, it had been about fence lines or water rights or some other issue that was going to be unpleasant regardless of how it started. So she'd learned that the feeling of someone riding into her yard carried its own specific variety of dread. She went to the window instead and looked. It was Gideon Mercer. He was sitting on a black horse she hadn't seen before, and looking at the roof of the house with the calm, assessing expression of a man who looked at structures the way he apparently looked at everything else, with the specific interest of someone who notices what needs fixing and is working out how serious it is. He wasn't looking toward the house for her. He was looking at the eaves, where she knew there was a section of wood that had started to pull away from the beam. She stood at the window for a moment, not sure what to do with this information. Then she opened the door. He looked down from the roof to her. "Miss Ashcroft." "Mr. Mercer." She stepped out onto the porch. "You're back." "Some cattle to look at north of here," he said. "Won't be in the area long." He looked at the eaves again. "Your northeast corner is pulling." "I know," she said. "It'll let water in if it goes through winter like that." "I know that too." A silence. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was nothing demanding in the way he looked at her. He wasn't waiting for her to invite him in or offer him anything, wasn't angling for anything she could detect. He just seemed to be there the way he was anywhere, with a kind of settled presence that she found herself noticing without quite knowing what to do with the noticing. "Is that why you came out here?" she asked. "To tell me about my eaves?" He considered the question with more seriousness than she'd meant it. "I came to check on the well," he said. "Wanted to make sure the mechanism held after the first hard freeze." She stared at him. He waited. "The well is around back," she said. He nodded and turned his horse toward the side of the house. She followed on foot, feeling slightly off balance in a way she didn't like, because she didn't like feeling off balance. She was steady. She'd built being steady into a kind of identity over the past 3 years, and someone arriving out of nowhere to check on her well was threatening that steadiness in a way she resented, and also, in some small back corner of herself she was not ready to examine, didn't entirely resent. He dismounted, tied the horse, went to the well, and checked the mechanism. He pressed the handle the way he'd shown her, worked it through several cycles, checked the pin. It held. He looked satisfied in the same quiet way he seemed to be satisfied with most things, without making a performance of it. "Held," he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He looked at the well for one more moment. Then he looked at her. "You doing all right out here?" The question surprised her, not because it was intrusive, it wasn't, or at least it wasn't meant to be, but because the last time anyone had asked her that, it had been her mother, and the memory hit her somewhere tender and unexpected. "I'm fine," she said, which was the answer she always gave and had been giving for 3 years, and which was true in most of the ways that mattered, and not true in a couple of ways she didn't discuss with anyone. He didn't look convinced. He also didn't push it. He just nodded, the way a person nods when they hear something and decide they'll let it sit for now. He untied his horse. "I'll be in the area a few more days," he said. "All right," she said. He mounted, turned the horse, rode out of the yard. She stood at the well for a while after he was gone, one hand on the mechanism, feeling the cold metal of the handle against her palm. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment without moving, and then she looked at the loaves cooling on the rack by the stove, and she thought about how he'd bought that bread and said it was worth taking home, and she thought about the well, and about the eaves, and about the specific quality of his attention, not intrusive, not demanding, just present and careful, and somehow worse than intrusive because she couldn't dismiss it. She pressed her palm flat on the kitchen table and stood there. Then she wrapped one of the loaves in cloth and set it on the porch step. She told herself it was because she had extra. That was not entirely a lie. He came back 4 days later. She was mending harness in the barn when she heard him ride in, and this time she didn't go to the window first. She just came out, still holding the harness, needle still threaded through the hole she'd been working. He was carrying something. It was wrapped in burlap, the size of a small barrel, and he carried it with the careful deliberateness of someone transporting something breakable. He set it down on the porch step and straightened up. "What is that?" she asked. "Stone crock," he said. "Better quality than the one you've got in the back room." She stopped moving. "How do you know what crock I've got in my back room?" He looked at her steadily. "You had the back room door open when I rode in last time. I saw it from the yard." He paused. "It's cracked. The beeswax won't hold past February." She looked at the wrapped crock on her step. She looked at him. She felt something stirring under her ribs that was partly irritation and partly something else, something she didn't name. "You bought me a crock," she said. "The starter needs a proper vessel," he said, in the tone of someone explaining something self-evident. "Mr. Mercer." She set down the harness carefully. I don't need gifts. It's not a gift, he said. It's practical. You buying me things is not practical. The crock costs less than losing a starter that's 30 years old, he said. That's practical. She opened her mouth, closed it. Because the thing was, he wasn't wrong about the math, and she hated that he wasn't wrong about the math. And she also suddenly wanted to know how he knew the starter was 30 years old and couldn't figure out when she'd told him that. I mentioned it to Ruth, he said, as if she'd asked out loud. She mentioned she'd heard it from you. You asked Ruth about me, Elena said. I asked Ruth what kind of bread she served at the boarding house. She told me where it came from, and something about the history of it. He looked at the burlap-wrapped crock without embarrassment. 30-year starters don't come back if you lose them. She stood there in the cold with her mending half done, and the crock on her step, and this man standing in her yard who kept solving problems she hadn't asked him to notice, and she tried to find the appropriate response and couldn't locate it. You could have just told me about the crock, she said finally. You didn't need to buy it. No, he agreed. I didn't need to. He didn't say anything else. He didn't try to make it mean less than it meant or more than it meant. He just let it sit there, the way he let most things sit, with the patience of someone who had learned that pushing things didn't make them go faster, it just made them go wrong. She looked at the crock. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. She didn't make a habit of inviting men into her house. She didn't make a habit of inviting anyone into her house. The kitchen was hers, the only entirely hers space on the whole property, the place where she moved the way she wanted and kept things where she wanted and didn't have to explain anything to anyone. Opening that door to another person felt like a significant thing even when she tried to treat it as ordinary. He came in and sat at the table she indicated and didn't look around the room in the intrusive way some people did, cataloging everything, measuring the space against expectations. He looked at the things directly in front of him, which was mostly the table, and waited. She put the coffee on and stood at the stove with her back to him and tried to think of something to say. How long have you been doing this? She asked. Buying cattle. 12 years, he said. You're from the East originally. Virginia, originally. Moved west when I was 19. She thought about that. Why? A pause that wasn't evasion, more like genuine consideration. I thought the land would be easier, he said. Turns out land is land. It requires what it requires regardless of which direction you came from. She turned around because that was an interesting thing to say, and she wanted to see his face when she responded to it. That's either wise or discouraging. I can't decide which. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one starting. Probably both. She turned back to the coffee. Do you like it, the work? I'm good at it, he said. That's not what I asked. Another pause. I like knowing the value of things, he said carefully. What they're actually worth, not what people say they're worth. I like being the person in the room who's done the calculation correctly. He stopped. That sounds cold. It sounds honest, she said. She poured the coffee and brought it to the table and sat down across from him, which felt odd and also not odd, which itself felt odd. He wrapped his hands around the cup the way people do when they're cold and not thinking about it. His hands were large and weathered and had clearly done considerable physical work, which she hadn't expected for a buyer, but which, now that she thought about it, made sense. You didn't judge cattle from a distance. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, he said. At the fair. She put her cup down. Why? He looked at her directly. Why what? Why bother? You didn't know whose bread it was. You could have walked out without saying anything. Most people would have. He considered that. The bread was worth what I paid for it, he said. The fact that the room disagreed didn't change what it was worth. You knew you were making a statement. I knew I was making a purchase, he said. What the room did with it was their business. She thought about that for a moment. And if I'd been the one who walked out after you said that, if I'd been embarrassed or it had made things worse for me instead of better, he looked at her with something that was more careful than she'd expected. Were you embarrassed? No, she said before she'd decided to answer. I don't know what I was. Something other than embarrassed, he said. Something other than embarrassed, she agreed. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The fire settled in the stove, that soft, crumbling sound that meant it had been going long enough to form good coals. and the kitchen was warm in a way that made the howl of the wind outside feel very far away. She had not sat at this table with another person in 11 months. She became aware of that all at once in the middle of the silence, and it landed differently than she'd expected it to. Not as a lack, the way she usually felt it, as an absence, the way you notice a tooth is gone because of the space it leaves. It landed as contrast, as the specific weight of the difference between the last 11 months and right now. She didn't say that. She looked at the table and said, "The crock is a good one. I can see the quality from here. What did it cost you?" "More than it cost you to accept it," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with that steady, direct quality she was starting to identify as simply how he looked at things. Not challenging, not performing, just honest. She picked up her cup. "I'll accept it this once," she said. "Don't make a habit of it." "All right," he said. He finished his coffee and stood up and said thank you for it, which was more than most people said, and put his hat back on and went to the door. She followed, not sure why, maybe just to close it behind him. He paused on the porch step where the crock was still sitting. "The starter," he said, without looking back at her. "How long did you say your mother kept it?" "I didn't say," she told him. He turned slightly. She could see the profile of his face, that particular quality of attention. "How long?" 30 years, she said. "Give or take." She got it from her mother. She said it was older than that, but she wasn't sure. He nodded. "Then it's worth more than a crock costs." He went down the steps and got his horse. "Take care of it." She watched him ride out of the yard, and she stood on that porch longer than made sense given that the temperature was dropping and her coat was inside, and she didn't go in until the sound of his horse had fully faded. The crock sat on the shelf in the back room for 3 days before she transferred the starter into it. She kept finding reasons to wait. The temperature wasn't quite right. She needed to make sure the new crock had been properly aired. She wasn't in the right frame of mind for it, which was a reason she didn't examine too closely, because examining it would have meant examining other things alongside it. On the 4th day, she did it. She moved the starter from the old cracked crock, carefully, with a wide wooden spoon, the way you'd move something you weren't allowed to drop, into the new one. The stone was cool and smooth and exactly the right weight, and the lid sealed with a satisfying, solid fit that her old crock hadn't managed in years. She cleaned the old crock and set it aside. She didn't throw it out. It had held the starter for 23 years, and it deserved better than the rubbish heap. She'd find something else for it. She stood back and looked at the new crock on the shelf. It looked right there. It looked like it belonged exactly where it was. She stood there for a minute and felt something move through her that was complicated and quiet, and didn't resolve itself into anything she could name. And then she went and baked bread, because it was Tuesday, and she had Ruth's delivery to make, and the chickens weren't going to feed themselves, and the world kept requiring what it required regardless of what was happening inside you. She baked the best loaf she'd made in months. She didn't know why. The recipe was the same, the starter was the same starter. The oven hadn't changed, nothing had changed. And yet, when she pulled it out and set it on the rack and stood in the warm kitchen with the smell of it filling every corner of the room, she pressed her hand to the crust and felt the heat come through her palm and thought about the word he had used. Worth. Just that one word. Not lovely or interesting or hearty or any of the other words people reached for when they were trying to say something without committing to it. Worth. She wrapped Ruth's loaf for delivery and set aside a piece of the second one for herself. She ate it at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light, without butter, the way she ate it when she wanted to taste what it actually was, rather than what she'd put on it. It tasted like what it had always tasted like. She just hadn't been tasting it for a while. Winter broke slowly that year, the way it sometimes did in that part of the country. Not all at once, but in stages, giving a little ground and then taking it back, so that by the time March arrived, you still couldn't trust it. Elena had learned not to trust March. March in Iron Hollow was a month that smiled at you and then put 6 inches of snow on the ground overnight, just to remind you who was in charge. She was splitting wood in the yard on a morning in early March when she heard the sound of a horse on the road. She kept splitting. People used the road. It wasn't remarkable. But the horse slowed at her gate, and when she looked up, it wasn't Gideon Mercer. It was Walter Grayson. She set the axe down. Walter Grayson was 51 years old, widowed 4 years ago, and owned the general store that anchored the south end of Main Street in Iron Hollow. He was a tall man, lean in the way that people who work on their feet all day get lean, with silver at his temples and a face that had settled into something that most people in town would have called distinguished. He was the kind of man who showed up to town meetings and said sensible things and was thanked for it. The kind of man whose opinion on any given subject was sought and generally followed. His wife, Margaret, had been well liked, and the whole town had mourned her death from fever with the kind of genuine grief that meant she'd actually earned it. He was not someone Elena had thought much about. In the specific way she tried not to think much about people who lived in the center of Iron Hollow's social gravity when she existed firmly on its edges. He had always been polite to her at the store. That was the extent of their relationship, such as it was. He rode up to the gate and took his hat off, which was either good manners or a signal, and she couldn't yet tell which. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Mr. Grayson." She looked at him without expression. "Something I can help you with?" "I hope so," he said. "I was wondering if I might have a few minutes of your time." She looked at the pile of unsplit wood. She looked at him. "All right," she said, and set the axe against the stump and went to the gate. He didn't ask to come inside. She appreciated that more than she would have been able to explain without it sounding strange. He leaned against the fence post with his hat in his hands and spoke to her the way a man speaks when he's rehearsed something but is trying not to sound like he's rehearsed it, and the attempt was visible but not offensive. He said he'd been aware of her for some time. He said he'd always had a great deal of respect for the way she managed the homestead on her own after her parents passed. He said he knew this might be unexpected, and he understood if she needed time to think about it. Then he said he'd like to court her, if she was willing. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard and made the bare branches of the cottonwood click against each other. "Why?" she said. He blinked. It clearly wasn't the response he'd prepared for. "Pardon?" "Why now?" she said. "It's been 3 years since my parents died, and you've had 4 years as a widower, and we've spoken maybe 30 words to each other in that entire time. Why now?" He was quiet for a moment. She respected that he didn't immediately reach for an answer, that he actually seemed to think about it. "I suppose I've been paying more attention than you realized," he said. "And I think what happened at the harvest fair, your bread, made me recognize something I should have recognized sooner." She hadn't been expecting him to mention the bread. Something shifted very slightly in her chest, not unpleasantly. "You saw that?" she said. "Half the town saw it," he said. "And I watched you walk out of that hall with more dignity than anyone in it, and I thought, I should have said something a long time ago." He paused. "I'm saying it now." She looked at him. I was a decent man. She could see that. He was not being dishonest. He was not performing something he didn't feel. He was standing at her gate on a cold March morning with his hat in his hands because he'd meant to come and he had come. And that took a certain kind of courage that she wasn't inclined to dismiss. She also felt nothing in particular, which was information. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's the most honest answer I can give you right now." He nodded. "That's all I'm asking for." He put his hat back on. "Can I call on you again? In a week or two, perhaps?" "You can," she said. He rode away. Elena stood at the gate and looked at the woodpile for a while, and then she picked up the axe and went back to work. And she didn't think about what had just happened so intensively that it was basically the only thing she thought about for the rest of the morning. He came back. Not in a week, in 5 days, which was close enough to a week that she didn't hold it against him. He brought flowers, which was the conventional thing to do, and which she therefore didn't know quite what to do with, because she didn't have a vase and had to put them in a mason jar, which seemed to either undermine or perfectly illustrate something about the whole situation. She wasn't sure which. He sat at her kitchen. She invited him in, because that was the appropriate thing when someone called on you formally. And they talked for an hour and a half in a way that was perfectly pleasant and perfectly easy and perfectly comfortable. Walter Grayson was a good conversationalist. He'd read things. He had opinions on them. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers, which was rarer than it should have been. He made her laugh twice, not with performed humor, but with the specific kind of dry observation that happens when someone has been watching the world long enough to find certain things genuinely absurd. When he left, she stood in the kitchen and looked at the mason jar with the flowers and thought, I could do this. This would be a reasonable life. The thought sat in her chest like something solid and manageable. She didn't think about Gideon Mercer. She thought about the flowers in the jar and the reasonable life, and whether reasonable was the right word for what she was reaching for. Then she went to feed the starter and stood in the back room with her hand on the stone crock and thought about Gideon Mercer anyway. He showed up in April. She didn't know he was in the area until she heard the horse and went to the window out of old habit and saw him dismounting at the gate, taller than she'd held him in memory, which was the annoying thing about people. They were always slightly different from how you remembered them. She stood at the window for a moment. Walter had called on her 3 times since March. Each visit had been pleasant. Each visit had felt like building something sensible, one careful brick at a time. The town had noticed. Of course the town had noticed. It always noticed. And the noticing had come with a specific kind of warmth directed at her that she hadn't experienced before. The warmth of being seen as belonging somewhere, fitting into something recognized and approved of. She opened the door and went out to the porch. Gideon was standing at the gate with his hat in his hand. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked, she thought, tired. Not the deep tired of illness, but the wearing down kind that comes from too many nights in too many different places with no fixed point to return to. "You're back," she said. "Passing through," he said. "Cattle north of here again." "The same herd?" "Different rancher, same territory." She came down the porch steps. He didn't move toward her, just stood at the gate with that stillness he had, the particular quality of a man who had learned to wait without looking like he was waiting. "How long are you in the area?" she asked. "Few days," he said. "Maybe more. Depends on the negotiation." She put her hand on the gatepost without opening it, because she suddenly wasn't sure if she should open it, and she was annoyed with herself for not being sure. "The well is still working," she said. "You don't need to check on it." Something crossed his face that was subtle, but there. "I know," he said. I just wanted to see how you were." She looked at him directly. "I'm well. The farm is well. The starter is very well, in the new crock." "Good," he said. He looked at the house briefly, then back at her. He seemed about to say something else. Then he didn't say it. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. "Are you going to keep riding through Iron Hollow every time you have business north of here, or is there something you actually want to say to me?" It was direct enough that most people would have flinched. He didn't flinch. He absorbed it the way he seemed to absorb most things, without drama, and then he said, "Is there something you'd prefer I did?" She made a sound that was close to a laugh, and not quite. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He looked down at his hat in his hands, which was the first time she'd seen him do something that read like uncertainty, and it landed differently than she'd expected. He was a man who was good at knowing the value of things, but she was starting to suspect he was less certain about his own. "There's a man calling on me," she said, because it seemed like the honest thing to say, and honesty was the thing she'd been doing with him from the beginning, whether she'd meant to or not. "Walter Grayson, he owns the general store." Gideon's expression didn't change, that careful steadiness. "I know who he is." "He's a good man," she said. "I know that too," he said. She watched him. "You have nothing to say about it." "It's not my business to have something to say about it," he said. The words were even, but something underneath them wasn't, and she could hear the underneath more clearly than the words. "That's the second time you've said something that doesn't mean what it says," she told him. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was flat and bright, the particular light of early April when the sun has altitude again, but no warmth yet, and it showed every line of his face without flattering anything. He didn't look away. "May I come back before I leave?" he said. "In a few days." She studied him. "Why?" "Because I need to think," he said, "and I think better when I know I have a reason to be somewhere specific." That was such an unexpected thing to say that she didn't have an answer ready for it. She just looked at him, and after a moment said, "All right." He put his hat on and mounted and rode away. She stood at the gate for a minute, then she went inside and stood in the kitchen and pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at the surface of the wood until her breathing evened out. Walter called on her 2 days later. He brought apples from his store's last winter stores, a practical gift that she liked better than flowers because at least she could do something with apples. He sat at the table with the same easy presence he always brought with him, and they talked, and he made her laugh again, and at some point during the visit he reached across the table and covered her hand with his in a gesture that was gentle and careful and asked nothing from her except what she chose to give. She looked at his hand on hers. She thought, this is what it is supposed to look like. This man, this kitchen, this hand. She thought about what Gideon Mercer had said about needing to think, and about having a reason to be somewhere specific, and she felt something pull at her from two directions at once, and the pulling wasn't comfortable. "Walter," she said. He looked at her. "I need to be honest with you," she said. I'm not certain about what I want. I think you deserve to know that." He looked at her hand under his. He didn't move his hand away. "Is it someone else?" She opened her mouth to say no and then didn't say it, because it wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't exactly the truth either, and she owed him the truth. "I don't know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through it, and what she saw in his face was not anger and not wounded pride, just something older and more resigned. The look of a man who had wanted something to go a specific way and was adjusting to the possibility that it wouldn't. "Mercer," he said. She looked at him. "The whole town sees it," he said quietly. "The crock, the well, the way he came into that hall." He paused. "I see it too. I'm not blind." "Nothing has happened," she said. "I know," he said, "but something is happening." He took his hand back gently, set it on the table in front of him. "I told you I'd been paying more attention than you realized. I meant that. I've been watching you for longer than you know." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was honest and a little sad. "But I'm not a man who will compete with something that was already there before I asked." "Walter, I'm not saying this to be dramatic," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true, and I think you prefer the truth." He stood up. "My offer stands. I mean that. I think we could build something good together. I genuinely believe that." He picked up his hat from the table. "But I'm asking you to be sure. Not for my sake, for yours. Because you've been alone long enough that I think you might take the first solid thing that's offered, even if it isn't the right thing." She sat at the table after he left and didn't move for a long time. He was right about one part of it. She had been alone long enough that the solid, sensible thing had a pull to it that had nothing to do with Walter Grayson specifically, and everything to do with the weight of 3 years of her own company. She knew that. She'd known it without being able to name it. She went to the back room and stood with her hand on the stone crock. She didn't know what she was looking for. Permission, maybe, or evidence. Something that would tell her which direction she was actually facing. The starter gave her nothing. It was just starter. It didn't have opinions. She went to bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Gideon came back on a Thursday. She was baking. Of course she was baking. It was Thursday, and she heard him ride in, and she didn't go to the window this time. She waited until he knocked at the door, which he did after tying his horse at the post and coming up the steps, and she wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. He was standing on the porch without his hat. He was holding it at his side, not in front of him the way people held hats when they were being formal, just down at his side, like a man who'd forgotten he had it. She looked at him. "I thought," she said. "Yes," he said. "And?" He looked at her for a moment and she could see it. The thing she'd been watching for since October, since the fair, since the well and the crock and the coffee at the kitchen table. It was moving under the surface of that careful face the way it had been all along, and whatever wall he'd kept between himself and saying it out loud was thinner now than it had been. "Can I come in?" he said. She stepped back and let him through. He came inside and stood in the kitchen with the smell of baking rye all around him and looked at the loaves on the rack and didn't say anything about them, which was somehow the right thing. He pulled out the chair at the table, the same one he always sat in, and she sat across from him, and they looked at each other over the table the way they'd looked at each other in October with the coffee between them. Except there was no coffee now, just the heat from the stove and the particular quiet of two people who had been circling something for half a year. "I've been moving since I was 19, he said. "You know that. You told me. What I didn't tell you is that I stopped knowing why." He looked at the table. At some point it stopped being about finding the right place and started being about the movement itself. Because if you keep moving, you don't have to notice what you're leaving behind. She was very still. "I noticed at the fair," he said. When I walked in and saw your bread on that table, I don't know how to explain that correctly. I just saw something that had been made with weight behind it, with actual care, the kind of thing that gets made by someone who isn't performing anything. He looked up at her. And then I saw you, standing at the wall, trying to hold your face together while those women walked past it. She felt something in her chest press outward. You didn't look at me at the fair, she said. You didn't even look at me when you said what you said. I know, he said, because if I'd looked at you, I wouldn't have been able to say it as plainly as it needed to be said. She sat with that for a moment. That is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me. I'm trying, he said. She looked at him. Walter has asked me to consider his proposal. I know, he said. He's a good man. He is, Gideon said. That's not in question. Then what is in question, she said. Because I need you to say it plainly. I need you to say exactly what you came here to say, because I've spent 6 months watching you almost say it, and I'm done watching. He met her eyes. He had the look of a man standing at the edge of something that was going to change where he was standing permanently, and he knew it, and he was doing it anyway. I've been looking for the right land for years, he said. I told myself that was what I was doing, looking at this territory and that one, calculating what it would take to build on it, thinking about whether it had what I needed. He paused. It wasn't land I was looking for. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, he said. I think you know that. And I'm not here to offer you poetry or promises I can't keep. I'm here because the only future I can actually picture, and I've tried to picture other ones, I want you to know I've tried, has you in it. He stopped. I want to build something that stays. I want to stop moving, and I want to do it here, if you'll let me. She looked at him across the table. She thought about Walter's hand on hers and the solid, reasonable life she'd been turning over in her mind for the past weeks. She thought about the mason jar with the flowers and the perfectly pleasant conversations and the laughter and how none of it had reached the place inside her that was still, after everything, waiting for something. She thought about the bread on the table in October and a stranger who bent down to smell it while the whole room decided it wasn't worth their time. You're not making a speech, she said. No, he said. You're not promising me anything grand. I don't make promises I haven't already thought through. What have you thought through? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I've thought through what it would take to be worth staying for, he said. And I know it's more than showing up and saying the right thing. I know it's work. I'm not afraid of work. She stood up, walked to the stove, stood there with her back to him for a moment, and then turned around. If you say this to me now, she said, and then you ride away again, that's the last time you ride in here. I need you to understand that. I understand it, he said. I'm not easy, she said, because he deserved to know this, deserved to hear it from her before he committed to anything. I don't ask for help well. I don't talk about things when I should. I've been by myself long enough that I've gotten particular about how I do things, and I'm not sure how much of that I can undo. I'm not asking you to undo it, he said. You say that now. I'll say it in 5 years, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. There was no performance in his face, no pitch, no calculated appeal, just the simple, slightly uncomfortable reality of a man who had said the true thing and was waiting to find out what happened next. She crossed back to the table and sat down. She said, Walter is coming on Sunday. Gideon didn't look away. All right. I'm going to tell him that I can't accept his proposal. Something moved in Gideon's face. A breath, maybe. The smallest loosening of something that had been held very carefully. Elena, he said. Don't, she said. Don't say anything grateful. If you're grateful, show up. That's all I'm asking. I'll show up, he said. Every time you say you will. Every time I say I will. She nodded. Her hands were on the table in front of her, and she looked down at them. Flowers still in the creases of her knuckles, a burn scar along her left thumb from an oven rack 2 winters ago. The particular roughness of hands that had been working since childhood and didn't look like what the women in town called kept. She had never been ashamed of her hands. She wasn't now. Coffee? She said. Yes, he said. She got up and put the coffee on, and they sat in the kitchen while the bread cooled on the rack and the fire settled in the stove, and outside the April wind moved across the open land toward the mountains in the distance, and neither of them tried to say more than had already been said. Sunday came. She told Walter the truth. She sat across from him at the same table and said it as clearly and gently as she could, which was not gently enough. It was never gently enough, the ending of hope. And she watched him receive it with the dignity she'd expected from him and the hurt he couldn't entirely hide. "It's Mercer," he said. Not a question this time. "Yes," she said. He nodded, stood, picked up his hat. He paused at the door the way people pause when they want to say one more thing and are trying to decide whether it will help or hurt. "He'd better be worth it," he said, not with bitterness, with the matter-of-fact quality of a man stating something he genuinely meant. "I believe he is," she said. Walter nodded once and went out the door and down the steps and didn't look back. And she watched him go with the specific grief that comes when someone who deserves something different doesn't get it. And when the sound of his horse faded, she sat back down at the table and sat there for a long time. She was not certain she'd made the right choice. She knew that. Certainty wasn't the thing. Certainty was a luxury, and she'd never been in a position to afford many luxuries. What she had was something more like a direction, the sense of a thing pointing somewhere true, even if the path to it was anything but clear. She went to the back room and fed the starter. She pressed her palm against the stone of the crock and stood there in the quiet. And she thought about a stranger walking into a hall full of people who had already decided, and cutting himself a piece of something they had passed over, and saying the true thing without any of them asking him to. She thought about how worth was different from admired, and how she had spent most of her life being neither, and was only just beginning to understand that one of those things actually mattered. She went back to the kitchen and she started another loaf. Because it was Sunday, and the bread didn't know that, and some things needed doing regardless of what else was happening inside you. He showed up on Wednesday. Not Sunday, not the following week. Wednesday, 3 days after Walter Grayson had walked off her porch with his hat in his hand and the particular dignity of a man absorbing something that hurt. Elena was in the north pasture when she heard the horse, doing the fence inspection she'd been putting off since the last freeze had heaved 2 posts out of alignment. She had mud on her boots and a pair of pliers in her hand, and her hair had come half out of its braid because she'd been bending and straightening all morning and hadn't bothered to fix it. She looked up and saw Gideon at the gate. He didn't ride in. He dismounted, tied the horse at the post, and came on foot across the yard to the pasture fence. And when he got close enough that talking didn't require raising her voice, he stopped. "You came Wednesday," she said. "I said I'd show up," he said. She looked at him. He looked at the fence post that was listing about 15 degrees off true. He said, "That one's heaved." "I know," she said. "2 of them. I was getting to it." "I can see that." He wasn't being sarcastic. He was just observing. "You need a second pair of hands to do it properly. Post wants to go right back in the hole. You push it from one side, it just moves out the other." She had in fact been trying to solve this exact problem for the past 40 minutes. She handed him the pliers without saying anything, went around to the other side of the post, and waited. They fixed both posts in less than 20 minutes. Gideon didn't make a production of it. He didn't say anything that underlined what was happening. That he was here, that he'd meant what he said, that he was proving something. He just worked. He had the quality she'd noticed from the beginning of someone who understood what a task required and gave it exactly that, without surplus and without shortcut. When they were done, she walked back toward the house, and he walked beside her, and they were quiet in a way that felt, for the first time, entirely ordinary, like a quiet that belonged there. "You told Grayson," he said. Not a question. "Sunday," she said. He nodded. "How was it?" She appreciated that he asked. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have left the subject alone or skipped past it with a kind of careful relief. "Hard," she said. "He's a decent man and he deserved better than I could give him." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He'll be all right." "I know he will," she said. "That doesn't make it better." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They reached the porch steps. She stopped and turned to look at him in the flat morning light. He looked tired still, the same wearing-down tired she'd seen in April, but there was something different in his face now that she couldn't name immediately. She looked at it for a moment, trying to figure out what it was. It was the look of a man who had stopped running and wasn't sure yet what to do with the stillness. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee, and you can tell me what kind of timeline you're thinking." He blinked. Timeline? You said you wanted to build something, she said. Building has a timeline. I'm practical, Gideon. You knew that when you came here. The corner of his mouth moved. I did know that. Then come inside and talk to me like it's real. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. It was not a romantic conversation. It was not the kind of conversation that appears in stories about love, where people say luminous things to each other by firelight, and the future arranges itself around their feelings like it's been waiting for a cue. It was a working conversation, the kind that happens when two people who are both constitutionally resistant to fantasy decide to approach a large, uncertain thing with the same honesty they'd apply to anything else large and uncertain. He talked about money. He had savings, 12 years of careful work in a trade that paid well for good judgment, and he'd been sitting on a larger portion of it than most people in his position would have, partly because he moved too often to spend much, and partly because he'd been waiting, without always acknowledging he was waiting, for a specific purpose. She talked about the homestead. The land her parents had owned clear, no debt on it, but the buildings needed work that she'd been patching instead of fixing for 3 years, because patching was what one person could manage, and proper fixing required either money she didn't have or help she hadn't asked for. He talked about work. He had contacts across 3 counties, buyers and ranchers who'd send him business if he settled in one place instead of drifting between territories. He could work out of Iron Hollow. He'd already been calculating it. She said, "You've been calculating it for a while." He said, "Since February." She said, "February was when you sent Ruth a letter asking about the area." He paused. "Ruth told you that." "Ruth tells me things when she thinks I should know them," Elena said. "She doesn't explain herself. She just says things." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not embarrassed by it. I'm not asking you to be," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me when you started thinking seriously about staying." He looked at the table. "The night after I bought the bread," he said. "I was at the boarding house eating it, and I thought, this was made by someone who knows how to wait, who knows that the right thing takes longer than the convenient thing and is worth the extra time." He glanced up. "And I thought I'd like to know a person like that." She looked at him for a moment. "That is a strange way to fall in love with someone." "I didn't say I was in love with you in October," he said carefully. "What were you in October?" He thought about it with the seriousness he gave most things. "Interested," he said, "genuinely interested, in a way that felt different from how I'd been interested in anything in a long time." She nodded. She could work with that. Interested that grew into something, that was a thing she understood. Love that arrived fully formed and declared itself the first day had never struck her as something she could trust. But something that started as noticing and kept finding more to notice. That was a different animal. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I'm not going to make this easy," she said, "not because I'm trying to be difficult, because I genuinely don't know how to do this without being myself. And being myself it's not always comfortable for the people around me." "You think I'm looking for comfortable?" he said. "I think most people are, when they get close enough to mean it," she said. "They start comfortable and then they want you to stay that way." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not most people." "No," she said. "You're not." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "But I've never tested that, have I? We've had coffee twice and fixed a fence post. We don't actually know each other." "That's what I'm here to find out," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Then find out." He found a room to let from the widow Cooper on the east side of town, a practical woman who asked no personal questions and made no personal observations, which suited him exactly. He paid 2 months in advance, which told Elena, when she heard it, that he intended to be around for at least that long. The rest she chose not to calculate. He came to the homestead 3 times that first week. Once to help with the roof section she'd been avoiding, the northeast corner, the one he'd spotted on his first visit, which had finally pulled far enough away from the beam that another week of rain would have meant water in the ceiling. Once to look at the root cellar, where one of the support posts had developed a worrying lean. Once just for coffee, which had stopped requiring an excuse, and which Elena was trying to be comfortable with and mostly was, except for the moments when she became suddenly aware of how much easier it had gotten and then got self-conscious about the ease itself. They argued on the 4th visit. It was about the barn roof. She had a plan for it. Partial re-roofing, the sections that were bad. Leave the rest for later when she had more money. He had a different plan, which involved doing the whole thing at once, which was the right way to do it, and which she knew was the right way to do it, and which was not the point. "I know it's the better approach," she said, standing in the middle of the barn with her arms crossed and the specific tension in her jaw that happened when she was right about something being wrong. "I'm telling you it's not an option right now." "I'm offering to cover the difference," he said. "I know you are." "Then what's the problem?" "The problem," she said, "is that I've been managing this farm on my own for 3 years, and I've gotten used to knowing exactly what's mine and what I've earned and what I owe to nobody. And the minute I start letting you pay for things, that changes." He looked at her. "We're not—" He stopped. Started again. "If we're going to be building something together, the money isn't yours and mine. It's ours." "We're not married," she said. "Not yet," he said. She looked at him sharply. He looked back without backing down from it. "You're very certain," she said. "I said what I meant," he said. "On Thursday, in April. I'm not less certain now." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the roof. The bad sections were obvious even from inside. The light coming through in places it shouldn't be, the particular gray quality of wood that had been wet and dried too many times. "Half," she said. "You cover half, and I cover half." "The math doesn't work out to—" "Half," she said. "Those are my terms." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, half." She uncrossed her arms. "Good." She looked at him. "I'm not trying to be difficult." "I know," he said. "You're trying to know what's yours." She looked at him for a moment. This man who kept translating her most stubborn qualities into something that sounded almost like respect, and felt something shift under her ribs that she was getting less afraid of feeling. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." The barn roof took 4 days. She worked alongside him. She told him she would, and she meant it. Not to prove something, not to supervise, but because it was her barn and her farm, and she did not intend to stand on the ground watching someone else fix what was hers. He'd understood that immediately and hadn't argued it, which was the right response. They worked in a rhythm that surprised her by developing so quickly. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected adjustment, friction, the particular awkwardness of learning another person's pace and method. What happened instead was something that felt almost like recognition, like two people discovering that they'd been trained by the same unnamed teacher. He didn't talk much when he worked. Neither did she. They communicated in the practical shorthand of people focused on a task, a gesture toward the next section, a word when something needed 2 sets of hands, a brief back and forth when they hit a complication with the beam at the east corner that required rethinking the approach. No performance. No commentary on the process. Just the work, moving forward. On the second afternoon, she handed him a water jar and he drank from it and handed it back without saying anything. And she drank from it and set it down, and neither of them commented on the fact that they'd just shared water from the same jar without thinking twice about it, which was a kind of intimacy she hadn't expected to arrive so quietly. The second night he stayed for supper. She hadn't planned it. She'd started cooking without thinking about it, and then looked up and he was still there, washing his hands at the basin, and she thought about telling him he could go back to Cooper's for his meal, and then didn't say it. She put 2 plates on the table instead. They ate in the same quiet they'd worked in. The food was simple, beans and salt pork and the bread, always the bread. And he ate it with the attention of someone actually tasting what they were eating rather than just consuming it, which she noticed and filed away. "You eat like someone who knows the difference between good food and bad," she said. "I've had a lot of both," he said. "On the road." "On the road." He looked at the bread. "The first time I tasted yours, I was trying to figure out what made it different. I couldn't pin it down exactly." "The age of the starter," she said. "Younger starters are more acidic. They give you that sharp sour. Older ones mellow out. They develop complexity that the acid covers up in a younger culture." He looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" "My mother," she said. "And the 20 years I've been baking it since I was old enough to stand at the counter." "You were 7? 8, she said. "My mother was impatient." A pause. "She was a good teacher, but she was impatient. She'd show you something once and expect you to have it. If you didn't get it the first time, she'd take over and do it herself, which didn't help you learn but was faster, so she did it anyway." He had the look of someone storing that. "You got it the first time?" "Usually," she said. "When I didn't, I came back at night and practiced until I did. I wasn't going to give her the opportunity to take it away from me. He smiled at that. Not the corner of the mouth thing she'd gotten used to, but an actual smile, brief and genuine and slightly caught off guard. That explains some things, he said. What does it explain? Why you do things until they're right, even when nobody's watching. She looked at her plate. My mother knew, she said. I don't know how. I'd come down in the morning and the bench would be exactly how I'd left it the night before. Flour in places she'd have cleaned up, and she'd just look at me in a way that said she'd figured it out, and she wasn't going to mention it. Was that her way of saying she was proud? Elena considered that. It was her way of not getting in the way, she said, which, for her, was the same thing. She looked up and found him watching her with that careful attention she'd gotten used to and still wasn't entirely sure what to do with. There was something in his face she couldn't fully read. Tenderness, maybe? Though it was the specific kind of tenderness that doesn't announce itself, that just exists quietly in the way a person looks at something they value. Tell me about Virginia, she said. He looked slightly surprised, which was satisfying. Why? Because you know more about my family than most people do, and I know almost nothing about yours. He looked at the table. There's not much to tell. There's always something to tell. You had parents. Yes. Siblings? One brother, older. He was quiet for a moment. We didn't get on well after my father died. He had ideas about how things should go that I disagreed with, and we disagreed about it until there was nothing left to disagree about. I left when I was 19. You haven't gone back? No. You don't miss it? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she was about to tell him he didn't have to answer. Then he said, I miss what I thought it was, not what it actually was. She understood that distinction exactly. It was the kind of sentence that could only be said by someone who had spent time being honest with themselves about the difference. My parents were better as a memory than they were sometimes as people, she said. My father drank. Not badly. He held it together. But you always knew when he was in a certain kind of mood, and you stayed out of it. My mother pretended it wasn't happening, which was her way of managing it, and it drove me insane as a child. She paused. I loved them both entirely. That's also true. He looked at her. You don't talk about them to people here. No. Why are you telling me? She thought about it honestly. Because you told me about your brother, she said. And it seemed fair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I haven't told anyone about my brother in about 6 years. How does it feel? She said. Strange, he said. Not bad, just strange. She nodded. She knew exactly what that felt like. The slight vertigo of saying something true that you've been keeping to yourself for long enough that speaking it feels like using a muscle you'd forgotten you had. They sat at the table for a while longer after the plates were empty and the fire settled in the stove, and the night pressed against the windows, and neither of them moved to end it. Iron Hollow noticed. Of course it noticed. The town had been watching from the moment Gideon started riding out to the homestead with the kind of attention that could generate 2 months of conversation on its own. But the watching shifted in quality as the weeks went on, and it became clear that this wasn't a passing thing. The barn roof was visible from the road. People saw the two of them on it. Ruth Daly mentioned at the dry goods counter, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone who happened to be in the store, that the homestead had been looking considerably improved lately. Mrs. Hargrove said to her particular circle that she wasn't sure what Elena Ashcroft thought she was doing, letting a man she barely knew work on her property. The implication being something about propriety, about the correct sequence of things, about what it meant when you weren't following the accepted order. What she actually meant, though she didn't say it, was that the situation was not conforming to the shape she'd expected it to take, which was no situation at all, which was Elena Ashcroft living alone on that homestead indefinitely while the town benignly ignored her. Elena heard about it through Ruth, who reported it with the brevity of someone delivering a weather update. Matter of fact, no editorial. Mrs. Hargrove's concerned about my propriety, Elena said. Said Ruth. She said that at the dry goods counter. To approximately 7 people, Ruth confirmed. Elena looked out the boarding house window at the main street. And what do people generally think? Ruth considered. I think they're trying to decide what to think, she said. which means they're watching, which means whatever you do next will tell them what to decide. Elena looked at her. And what do you think I should do? Ruth picked up her account book. I think you should do whatever you were going to do anyway, she said. You always have. Gideon proposed on a Tuesday morning. It was not the setting of a story. It was the yard behind the house, and she had just come out of the barn, and he had arrived 20 minutes earlier with lumber he'd picked up from the mill because they'd agreed the previous week that the south side of the house needed new framing in the lower wall. He was stacking the lumber near the house wall, and she was watching him assess the wall itself, noting where the old wood would need to come out, when he stopped and turned around. He had not rehearsed this. She could tell he hadn't rehearsed it because he looked like a man who had decided to say something in the moment of deciding and was already too committed to go back. Elena, he said. She looked at him. I want to marry you, he said. Not because you need someone to take care of the property, or because it would look right to the town, or because I'm trying to do the next logical thing. I want to marry you because the only version of my life I can picture as something I actually want to live has you in it. And I've been trying to picture other versions so I could feel certain, but every other version I can picture feels like it's missing the center of it. She stood in the yard. Her boots were muddy. She had chaff in her hair from the barn. The lumber was stacked beside the house, and the morning was cold and bright, and nothing about this moment looked the way people describe proposals looking. I'm 31 years old, he said. I've been moving my whole adult life. I don't want to move anymore. I want to build something here, and I want to build it with you, and I'm asking you. Not because I've run out of other options or because it's convenient, but because you are the specific person I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the things she'd told herself she was afraid of. That he'd leave. That the stability was borrowed, not real. That she'd been alone long enough to mistake relief for something deeper. She'd turned all of those fears over in the months since April, and she'd looked at them honestly, which was the only way she knew how to look at anything, and she'd reached a conclusion. The fears were real, and they didn't change what was also true. Yes, she said. He went very still, like a man who had been holding himself under tension for a long time and had just been told he could stop. Yes, she said again. I'm asking you to remember this moment the next time we argue about the barn roof or whose turn it is to be wrong about something. I'm asking you to remember that we both went into this with our eyes open. I'll remember it, he said. I'm serious, she said. I know you are, he said. That's why I'm marrying you. She made a sound that was nearly a laugh. He crossed the yard and she let him, and when he put his arms around her, she felt the particular warmth of something that was real and imperfect and not going anywhere. And she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder and allowed herself, for exactly that moment, to be done being alone. Then she stepped back and said, The lumber isn't going to move itself. He looked at her. That corner of the mouth thing, fully earned. No, he said, it isn't. They worked the rest of the morning. The wedding was in June. Not a grand ceremony, not the elaborate affair that Iron Hollow sometimes put on for its more prominent families, with flowers ordered from 2 towns over and a reception that lasted until midnight and gave everyone something to talk about for months. It was a simple ceremony in the town hall, which was the same building where Elena's bread had been passed over 9 months earlier, and she had chosen it deliberately and without explaining to anyone why. The Reverend said the necessary words. Gideon said his. Elena said hers without her voice shaking, which she had been privately concerned about and which she was privately proud of. When it was done, and the small group of witnesses, Ruth, a few people from town, a rancher Gideon had worked with who'd ridden 3 hours to be there, were moving toward the table where someone had put out a modest amount of food, Elena stood for a moment in the middle of the town hall and looked at the table where the bread contest had been held. The tables were different now, pushed to different positions. There was no trace of the October arrangement, but she knew where the end of the judging table had been, and she looked at the spot on the floor, and she thought about standing there with her hands pressed into fists and the hall going quiet, and she thought about what had been true at that moment that she hadn't known yet. Gideon came to stand beside her. He followed her gaze to the floor. You're thinking about October, he said. Yes, she said. Any regrets about the venue? She looked at him. Not one, she said. He offered her his arm, which was formal enough that she raised an eyebrow at him. We're at our wedding, he said. Fair point, she said, and took his arm. Ruth caught her eye across the room and gave her a nod that contained a great deal. Approval, maybe, and the satisfaction of someone who had been silently correct for a long time and wasn't going to make a large thing of it. Elena nodded back. Mrs. Hargrove was there, because small towns required you to include people you wouldn't have chosen, and she stood at the edge of the gathering with the look of a woman recalibrating. She had been on the wrong side of the October judgment, and she knew it, and Elena's particular choice of venue seemed to be making that fact quietly and inescapably clear to everyone in the room, without Elena having to say a word about it. Elena looked at her once, then looked away. She was done requiring Mrs. Hargrove to feel anything about her. That, she realized, was its own kind of freedom. The first months of marriage were not the frictionless merging of two lives that people who hadn't done it sometimes imagined. She'd known they wouldn't be. She'd gone in clear-eyed, which she'd promised herself she would, and clear-eyed meant accepting that putting two stubborn, self-sufficient people in permanent proximity was going to produce friction, and friction was going to require work. The arguments were specific and practical more than emotional, because that was who they both were. Money, twice. The best approach to the South pasture. Whether to expand the bread operation beyond Ruth's boarding house, she wanted to. He thought the timing was wrong. They were both half right, and it took 3 weeks of intermittent discussion to arrive at something neither of them fully liked, but both could live with, which was how good decisions usually worked when two people were actually engaged with them, rather than one person winning and the other conceding. There was one night in late August, 3 months in, where the friction went somewhere sharper. She had made a decision about the property boundary on the east side without discussing it with him first. A small thing, practically speaking, moving a fence line 3 yards to fix an old inaccuracy in the original survey. But she'd done it alone, early in the morning, and when he'd come out and seen the post she'd moved, he'd been quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. "You did this without telling me," he said. "It's my land," she said, and knew as she said it that it was the wrong word. Knew it from the shift in his face, not anger, something colder and more considered than anger. He said, "Is it?" She set down what she was carrying. She looked at him. They were having this argument in the middle of a pasture, and the morning was bright and clear, and she could feel something pulling at a seam between them that was new enough to be fragile. "I meant it's the homestead," she said, "my family's land. I've been making decisions about it for 3 years. "You've been making them alone for 3 years," he said. "You're not alone anymore." "I know that," she said. "Do you?" Not genuinely asking. She stood there. The fence posts were in the ground. The decision was already made. That was the thing about the decisions she made quickly. They were already done by the time anyone else encountered them, which was a habit she'd built for survival, and which was not always the right tool for the situation she was in now. "No," she said. "Not completely." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not asking you to run everything past me," he said. "I'm not asking you to get permission. I'm asking you to tell me, before. So I know what's happening on the land I'm building on." She looked at the fence posts. "That's fair," she said. "I know it is," he said. She looked at him. "I'm going to do it again," she said. "Not on purpose. It's how I'm built." "I know," he said. "And I'm going to tell you when you have. And I'm going to be annoyed when you do. And I'm going to wait until you're done being annoyed, and then we'll fix it," he said. "That's probably how this goes." She let out a breath that had some tension in it she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You're very calm about this." "I'm not calm," he said. "I'm just not interested in making it worse." She nodded, picked back up what she'd set down. "Next time I'll tell you first," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. He came and stood beside her, and they looked at the fence line together, and after a moment she said, "It is 3 yards more accurate to the original survey." "I know," he said. "I checked." She looked at him. "You already checked?" "I checked before I said anything," he said. "I wanted to know if you were right." "Was I?" "Yes," he said. Something about that, the fact that he'd looked at the evidence before forming the objection, made her feel a warmth toward him that was specific and not sentimental. It was the warmth of recognizing someone who operated the way she operated, who went to the actual facts of a thing before deciding what to think about it. "Good," she said. "Then we agree the fence is where it should be." "We agree on the fence," he said. "We're still discussing the process." The process was wrong, she said. I acknowledged that. You did. So we're done? For now, he said. A pause. Probably. She almost laughed. She didn't quite. But the space where the laugh would have been was warm and light and nothing like the space that had been there when she first came out to find him looking at the moved posts. This was what it was then. Not smooth, not resolved, just ongoing. A permanent conversation between two people who were both too honest to pretend it was simpler than it was and too committed to each other to let the complexity become an excuse. She could live with that. She was in fact already living with it. And it was better than anything the reasonable life had offered her in that cold March when Walter Grayson had stood at her gate with flowers she'd put in a mason jar and talked about stability, as though stability were the same thing as a life you actually wanted. By the time October came around again, the homestead looked different than it had the year before. The barn roof was solid. The house framing on the south wall was new. The fence lines were correct. There was a second horse in the paddock, and a plan drawn out on paper on the kitchen table for a larger root cellar that would take them most of next spring to build, but would change what she could store through winter. She stood on the one evening in the early October cold, the same cold as a year ago, and looked at the yard and felt something she hadn't felt standing in this same spot in a very long time. Not contentment exactly, something less settled than that and more alive. The feeling of something that was actually in motion towards something real, rather than simply persisting in place and calling it enough. Gideon came out and stood beside her. He had a cup in each hand and he gave her one without asking if she wanted it because he already knew she did. She wrapped both hands around the cup. "It's been a year," she said. "Since October," he said. "The fair." "Are you sorry?" she said. Not anxious, just asking. He looked out at the yard. "No," he said simply. "Are you?" She looked at the barn roof and the straight fence line and the yard that had the specific lived-in quality of a place where actual work happened every day. "No," she said. They stood on the porch in the cold and drank their coffee, and the wind moved across the open land the way it always did, carrying the smell of cold grass and coming winter. And above them the sky was the deep clear blue that only happens in October when the air is dry and the light is already going low in the afternoons. And Elena Ashcroft, Elena Mercer, now, though she still thought of herself by both, stood in the place where she had always stood and felt, for the first time, like she was choosing to be there rather than simply being unable to leave. That was the difference. She hadn't known before that there was one. Now she did. 5 years is long enough to stop counting. That was something Elena noticed somewhere in the middle of the 5th year, that she had stopped tracking the time the way she'd tracked it in the 3 years alone, when each season had felt like something to be survived and cataloged and set behind her. Those years she'd felt the passage of time like a physical thing, like weather moving through. Now time moved differently. Not faster exactly, but fuller, denser. The days had weight to them that the old days hadn't had, because the old days had been hers alone to carry, and carrying anything alone for long enough makes you very aware of the load. Now the weight was distributed differently, and she felt it less, and that was the thing she hadn't expected. Not the happiness, which she'd been too practical to promise herself, but the specific relief of not having to hold everything at once. The homestead in the 5th year looked like a different property than the one she'd been running alone. Not because it was grander, it wasn't, and she didn't want it to be, but because it was solid in a way it hadn't been. The buildings were sound, the fences were where they were supposed to be. The root cellar they'd built the spring after the wedding was deep enough and well constructed enough that she could put up stores in October and not lie awake in January, worrying whether they'd hold. Gideon had built his business out of the spare room off the kitchen, which was a room that had held old equipment and boxes of her parents' things when he moved in, and which they had cleared out together over the course of a February weekend that had turned into the most sustained conversation they'd ever had. Because going through her parents' things required talking about her parents, and talking about her parents required the kind of honesty that didn't happen standing in a yard or working on a roof, but did happen, it turned out, when you were sitting on the floor surrounded by the accumulated evidence of 2 lives. He'd found a photograph of her mother at maybe 30 years old, standing outside the house with a loaf of bread in both arms, squinting slightly into the sun. Elena had looked at it for a long time without speaking. "She looks like you," he said. She'd have hated hearing that, Elena said. She thought I took after my father. Why did she think that? Elena looked at the photograph. Because I was stubborn and didn't ask for help and made decisions without consulting anyone. A pause. She said that like it was my father's fault. Whose fault was it? She looked at him. Hers, she said. Entirely. She just didn't want to admit it. He'd smiled at that. She'd put the photograph on the shelf in the kitchen, where it still was in the 5th year, her mother holding bread, squinting, looking exactly like a woman who knew the value of what she was carrying and wasn't interested in explaining it to anyone who didn't already understand. The bread business had grown in ways Elena hadn't entirely planned, which was usually the way the best things happened. It had started with Ruth's boarding house, which had been the arrangement from the beginning. Then one of Ruth's guests, a merchant passing through who'd eaten Elena's bread 3 mornings running and had strong feelings about it, had asked to buy 2 extra loaves to take with him. Ruth had told him to ask Elena directly. He had. Elena had sold them to him at a price that reflected the actual work involved, which was higher than he'd expected and which he'd paid without argument, which told her something. The following spring, she'd made a deliberate decision to expand. Not dramatically. She wasn't interested in turning the kitchen into a commercial operation, and she was honest with herself about the limits of what she could produce without sacrificing the quality that made it worth producing in the first place. But she started a regular arrangement with 2 households in town who wanted a loaf a week reliably, then 3, then eventually 6, which was the number she'd settled on as the maximum she could sustain without the baking becoming something she resented. Gideon had been right about the timing, back when they'd argued about it. She'd been right about the direction. They'd both known it and had eventually stopped pretending the disagreement was about anything other than 2 people who were both occasionally right about different aspects of the same thing. The bread didn't become famous in any dramatic sense. That was the kind of story that happened to other people in towns where things got written down and published. What happened in Iron Hollow was quieter and more real. People started knowing about it, and then knowing about it became the kind of thing that got passed along when someone new came to town, and eventually there was a general understanding in the community that Elena Mercer's bread was the kind of thing worth going a little out of your way for. She heard about it secondhand, usually. Someone would mention it to Gideon, who would tell her in the evening without making too large a thing of it. She preferred to hear it that way. The direct compliments still made her slightly uncomfortable, which she'd accepted as a permanent feature of who she was, rather than something to be corrected. What she noticed more than the compliments was something subtler. The women who had stood at the judging table in October 5 years ago and walked past her bread without tasting it. She saw them at the dry goods store, at the well, passing on the road. And the way they looked at her had changed. Not into warmth, exactly. Into something more complicated than warmth and more honest. A kind of reckoning with something they hadn't gotten right, that they couldn't address directly and so expressed sideways. Through a nod that meant more than a nod. Through an absence of the particular quality of dismissal that had been in their manner before. Elena didn't require their apology. She'd understood by the 5th year that requiring it would have meant giving it power it no longer had. The children arrived in the 3rd and 4th years respectively. A daughter first, Clara, who came into the world with a stubbornness that the midwife mentioned was notable even by the standards of someone who had seen a great many births. Elena had looked at Gideon over the midwife's shoulder, and he had looked back with the expression of a man who was making a calculation about what the next 20 years were going to be like, and finding the number simultaneously alarming and right. A son. The following year, James, who was quieter than his sister from the start, and had Gideon's quality of watching things before committing to an opinion about them, which Elena recognized and felt something about that she couldn't have fully explained to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to trust that quality in a person. Having children broke open things she hadn't known were closed. She hadn't planned on that. She'd been prepared for the practical difficulties, which were real and constant, and she'd been prepared in a general sense for love, because she wasn't naive about what she was agreeing to when she agreed to children. What she hadn't been prepared for was the way it changed her relationship to her own history, to her parents, to the starter, to the house, and the land, and the slow accumulation of everything she'd held alone before she didn't have to hold it alone anymore. The first time she put Clara's hand against the side of the stone crock, showing her the warmth of the active starter the way her mother had shown her, she had to stop and press her lips together and hold something in that was bigger than she'd expected. Gideon was in the doorway of the back room. He'd seen her face. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it. And also both of them understood that yes in this instance was a large word containing something complicated. "She has the same look you get," he said, "when you're trying to figure out how something works." Elena looked at her daughter, who was pressing both hands against the crock with the deep concentration of a 2-year-old encountering something interesting. "Don't read too much into that." "I'm not reading anything into it," he said. "I'm observing." "You observe too much." "It's kept me employed," he said. She looked at him over her daughter's head, and she felt, not for the first time and not for the last, but with a particular sharpness in that moment, the specific quality of what she'd said yes to in the yard behind the house, when he'd come to her without rehearsal and told her the true thing. She had said yes to this. To a man in a doorway. To a daughter with her hands on a crock. To the fact that the starter her mother had kept for 30 years would now be kept by someone who was half her and half this man, and entirely her own. And that was the meaning of continuity that nobody had been able to explain to her when she was young enough to still be asking what things meant. She didn't say any of that. She just turned back to the crock and said to Clara, "Feel how warm it is?" Clara pressed harder with both palms. "Warm," she said, with the satisfaction of a child correctly identifying a thing. "That means it's alive," Elena said. "It's always alive. That's the whole point." The 5th autumn, October again, was the first year Elena entered the harvest fair. She hadn't planned to. She'd avoided it deliberately for 4 years without making a formal decision about it, just finding reasons every September to be doing something else on the day of the contest, which was easy enough to arrange when you had a farm and 2 children and a business to run. Gideon had never pushed it. He understood, without asking for an explanation, that the fair was complicated in a way that didn't resolve itself neatly just because circumstances had changed. It was Clara who decided it. She was 5, which was old enough to understand that a fair existed and young enough to believe that existence was sufficient reason to attend. She'd been told about the fair by the Cooper boy from town, who was 6 and considered himself an authority on local events, and she had come home from an afternoon at Ruth's boarding house, where she sometimes spent time while Elena made deliveries, and announced at dinner that they were going to the fair. "Are we?" said Elena. "Yes," said Clara, with the certainty of someone who has not yet learned that the world sometimes disagrees with her. Gideon looked at Elena over Clara's head. Elena looked at her plate. "We'll see," she said, which was the adult version of not yet, and both children understood instinctively that it was not a no. She lay awake that night thinking about it. Gideon was asleep beside her with the ease of a man who had genuinely made peace with not being able to solve everything, which was a quality she'd initially found baffling and had come to understand was one of the things that made him possible to live with. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the end of the judging table and the sound the hall had made when Gideon had said what he'd said, and she thought about whether going back for something you'd been dismissed at was a reclaiming or just a performance of reclaiming, and whether there was a meaningful difference. She decided there was only one way to find out. She baked the same bread. Not a variation, not an improved version, not something adjusted to be more palatable to whoever was judging this year. The same dark rye with the same caraway seeds in the same quantities, from the same starter that was now in its 35th year or thereabouts. In the same rhythm she'd been baking it since she was 8 years old, and her mother had showed her once and expected her to have it. She shaped it the same way, scored the same 3 cuts across the top. She pulled it from the oven at the same point in the color she always aimed for, which was darker than most people thought bread should be, and which was exactly right. Gideon was at the table with James in his lap when she set it on the cooling rack. He looked at it. He didn't say anything about it, which was the right thing. Clara was standing at the counter watching it cool with the focused attention of someone engaged in a scientific process. "Is that the one we're taking?" she said. "Yes," said Elena. "It smells good," said Clara. "It is good," said Elena. "How do you know before you taste it?" Elena looked at her daughter. "Because I know what went into it," she said, "and I know how it's supposed to feel when it comes out right." Clara considered this with great seriousness. "What does right feel like?" Elena thought about it honestly. "Like it didn't fight you," she said. "Like everything you put in came together the way it was supposed to. Clara nodded as though this made complete sense, which, to a 5-year-old who had never baked anything, it probably didn't, but she had the quality of accepting information on faith when it came from someone she trusted and working out the meaning later. That, Elena thought, was going to serve her either very well or very badly, depending on circumstances. The town hall was the same building, smaller feeling than it had been the first time, though Elena knew it hadn't actually changed dimensions. Things shrank when you stopped being afraid of them. She walked in with Clara at her side and James on Gideon's shoulders, and the bread under her arm, and she went to the judging table and set it at an empty spot without looking at what was around it. She stepped back. Clara immediately pressed herself against Elena's leg and looked at the table with the suspicious assessment of a child trying to understand why adults did things. "That one's very white," she said, pointing at the honey bread. Mrs. Hargrove's again, 3 positions down. "Yes," said Elena. "Why is yours so dark?" "Because it's made from a different kind of flour," Elena said, "and it's older." "The bread is older?" "The thing that makes it rise is older," Elena said. "It's been alive for 35 years. It makes the bread taste different." Clara looked at the loaf with a new expression. "It's alive in there?" "Part of it," Elena said. Gideon came up behind them and put his hand briefly on the back of Elena's neck, which was a thing he did that meant nothing in particular and everything in general, and she leaned back into it for exactly 1 second before straightening up again. The judging began. The judges were different women than they'd been 5 years ago. Younger, 2 of them, with the third being a woman named Patterson who'd moved to Iron Hollow 2 years back and had no history with Elena one way or the other, which was its own kind of relief. They moved down the table with the careful deliberateness of people who understood they were being watched. When they reached Elena's bread, they stopped. One of them bent down and smelled it. Actually bent, the way Gideon had bent 5 years ago in this same building, and the sight of it did something to Elena that she hadn't expected. A small loosening in her chest, like a knot that had been so long in place she'd stopped knowing it was there. They tasted it, all 3 of them, which wasn't always what happened. Sliced pieces with the knife provided for the purpose and tasted it without speaking to each other, which meant they were forming individual opinions rather than influencing each other, which was the sign of judges who were actually judging rather than performing judgment. Elena watched. Clara watched more intensely because she had no reason to pretend she wasn't watching, and the directness of children is one of the most honest forces in the world. One of the younger judges looked up at Elena. "Sourdough?" she said. "Yes," said Elena. "Long ferment?" "Overnight, minimum. Sometimes longer, depending on the temperature." The judge nodded slowly. "What's in the score?" "Caraway," said Elena. 3 directions, same depth. The judge looked at the loaf for another moment, said nothing else. Moved on. Elena looked straight ahead and breathed. She won 2nd place. Not first. Mrs. Hargrove's honey bread won first again, which Elena had half expected, and which she found, examining her feelings about it with the same honesty she applied to everything, that she genuinely didn't mind. First place wasn't why she'd come. She'd come to put the bread on the table, in this building, and have it tasted by people who were actually looking at it. And 2nd place was a result that could only be achieved by actually tasting something and deciding it was the second best thing in the room, which was a fundamentally different act than walking past it in silence. The younger judge found her after the announcement. "The starter," she said. 35 years? "Give or take," said Elena. "My mother got it from her mother. She wasn't sure exactly how old it was when she got it." The woman looked at her with something that was close to reverence, which Elena still didn't know entirely how to receive. "How do you maintain it through winter?" "Keep it close to the stove," Elena said. "Feed it regularly. Talk to it when you're worried about it." The woman blinked. "Talk to it?" "I don't know if it helps the starter," Elena said. "It helps me." She paused. "When something matters to you, you pay attention to it. Paying attention out loud is still paying attention." The woman laughed, surprised. "That's the most practical thing I've ever heard said about bread." "It's practical about most things," Elena said. She found Gideon near the cider table, where he had positioned himself with James on his hip, and Clara eating something she'd been given by someone whose identity Elena decided she wasn't going to investigate. He looked at her. She showed him the second-place ribbon, which she was holding by the tail the way you hold something you're pleased with but not performing being pleased with. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her face. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it. "Like I put the bread on the table," she said, "and the table wasn't afraid of it." He nodded. That was enough. For him it was enough, and for her it was enough, which was one of the reasons they worked. Clara materialized at Elena's elbow and looked at the ribbon. "Did you win?" "Second place," Elena said. Clara thought about this. "Who got first?" Elena pointed at Mrs. Hargrove's honey bread across the room. Clara studied it with the critical eye of someone with a vested interest. "Ours is better," she said. "You haven't tasted theirs," Elena said. "I know ours," Clara said with complete confidence. Gideon covered his mouth with his free hand. Elena looked at her daughter and felt something move through her that was warm and complicated and had no simple name. Pride, maybe, but not only that. Recognition. The specific recognition of a quality she knew in herself appearing in someone who was and wasn't her, who would carry certain things forward without knowing she was carrying them, the way Elena had carried things forward without always knowing it either. They walked home in the early evening, the four of them, in the October cold. The children were tired in the particular way of children who've been stimulated past their capacity and are now running on something denser than energy, something closer to stubbornness. James had fallen asleep on Gideon's shoulder by the time they reached the edge of town. Clara was holding Elena's hand and had stopped talking, which was unusual enough that Elena checked her face and found her simply processing, taking in the road and the dark and the cold air with the focused interior attention she sometimes had that made her look briefly older than 5. "Mama?" she said, after a long while. "Yes," said Elena. "The bread we took today." A pause. "Is it from the thing that's been alive for 35 years? "Yes," said Elena. Clara walked in silence for a moment. "Will I get it someday?" Elena looked down at her. "The starter?" "When I'm big," Clara said. "Will you give it to me?" Elena held her daughter's hand in the cold, and they walked on the road between the fields, and above them the October sky was the same deep clear blue she'd stood under 5 years ago on her porch with Gideon and a cup of coffee, and she thought about the photograph on the kitchen shelf of her mother holding bread in the sun, and she thought about her mother's mother, who she'd never known, and about all the hands the starter had passed through to arrive at this specific evening on this specific road with this specific child asking the right question. "Yes," she said. "I'll give it to you." Clara seemed satisfied with that in the way children are satisfied by answers that confirm what they'd already decided. She held Elena's hand and kept walking. Gideon shifted James on his shoulder and glanced at her. She met his eyes. There was nothing that needed to be said, which was, she'd found, the measure of the kind of understanding that actually meant something. Not the grand declarations, though he'd made one, in the yard, and she'd meant what she'd said in the town hall. But this. The quiet look across the road in the October dark that contained everything that had happened between October 5 years ago and right now, and didn't need to name any of it. That night, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Elena went to the back room. She fed the starter. She did it the way she always did it, the right amounts, the right temperature water, the movements she'd been doing for 20 years in this same back room and before that in her parents' back room and would do, she understood now, until she couldn't do them anymore, and then Clara would do them after her. She pressed her palm against the stone crock. She stood there in the back room with the lamp throwing its yellow light and the cold coming in around the edges of the window, and she thought about the woman she'd been in this same room 5 years ago, standing here the night after the fair, with her hand on the old cracked crock, and her chest full of something that hadn't had a name yet. She thought about how she'd looked at the crock that night and thought about the word worth, and how she hadn't known then what it meant to find someone who used that word and meant it the same way she did. She thought about everything that had been built since then, not just the barn roof and the root cellar and the fence lines, the harder things. The things you build between two people that are invisible from the outside but bear all the actual weight. The trust that develops through argument as much as agreement. The specific shorthand of people who have been honest with each other long enough that they can say difficult things without destroying anything. The knowledge that someone will still be there in the morning regardless of what the evening was. She hadn't known she was building any of it while she was building it. That was the thing. You didn't know what you were building while you were building it. You only saw the shape of it later when you stood back far enough. She heard Gideon's footstep in the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. "I'm coming," she said. "Take your time," he said. He didn't come in. He went back to the kitchen, and she heard the soft sound of him sitting down at the table. He sometimes read in the evening, in the kitchen, in the particular stillness of the house after the children slept. And she stood for another moment with her hand on the crock. She thought about Clara asking if she'd get the starter someday. She thought about the word someday, and what it required of you, and how you had to be willing to invest in someday without knowing what it would look like when it arrived, which was the only way investing in anything real actually worked. Not because you were promised a return, because you believed the thing itself was worth the work. She took her hand off the crock, covered it, took the lamp and went back to the kitchen. Gideon looked up from his reading. She sat down across from him the way she'd sat across from him at this table more times than she could count now, in every kind of conversation and every kind of silence that two people accumulate over years. She asked if she could have the starter, Elena said. "When she's old enough." He looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She'll lose it at least once," he said, "and have to rebuild from the backup." "Probably," Elena said. "That's how you learn to take care of it." He looked at her with that quality she still noticed, after 5 years, and didn't expect to stop noticing. The quality of someone paying full attention, not because it was required of them, but because they'd decided you were worth the full attention and hadn't undecided. "You still have the backup?" he said. "Always," she said. He nodded, went back to his reading. She looked at the shelf where her mother's photograph sat, the woman holding bread in the sun with her eyes squinting against the light, looking like a woman who knew exactly what she was carrying and was not going to explain it to anyone who couldn't already tell. She looked like that, Elena thought. She didn't know when that had started being true, but she looked like that now. Outside, the October wind moved across the land the way it always did, the way it had moved the night Elena had ridden home from the fair with her chest full of unnamed things and her hands empty where a loaf had been. 5 years ago. A different October, the same wind, the same land. She was still here. She had always been here. She had simply, finally, chosen it. And there was a difference between those two things that had taken her most of her adult life to understand, and which she now knew so completely that she couldn't imagine ever having not known it. The bread on the cooling rack from the morning's leftover baking sat under its cloth by the stove. Tomorrow she would deliver Ruth's loaf. She would feed the starter. She would work whatever needed working. And somewhere on a backroom shelf in a house on the edge of Iron Hollow, a thing her great-grandmother might have touched was alive in a stone crock, patient and complicated and indifferent to approval, carrying forward the specific weight of everything that had gone into it, the way most things worth keeping do.